Hello and welcome to another session of Karen's Colours. I'm Dr. Karen and these are my colour conversations. In this session we're going to be examining the colour purple, not the book, not the film, the actual hue purple. It's a very interesting hue because it's one that has a long history and lots of specific ideas attached to it. But first, I'd like to welcome back those of you who've been watching this series of videos on colour, and thank you for taking the time to listen in. If you're new to this channel, you're doubly welcome, and I certainly hope that you will both like this video, but also perhaps consider subscribing. It doesn't cost you anything, and I'm sure that you will get some benefit out of the knowledge that I hope to impart to you. So let's begin. Purple, the colour of drama and power, and quite a few other things as well. This video will entail a number of different topics. Firstly, we're going to look at the features of the colour purple. Then we'll have a look at its history. After that, we'll examine how purple became a basic colour term, and then what its cultural uses were. Now, this is an enormous topic, and because of that, I've only selected a few items. So please, if you are disappointed that I haven't mentioned your particular cultural use, I'm sorry, there's no room for that in a video that's as short as this one. Finally, I'll be looking at the effects of purple in terms of how it is seen by the people who use it. Positive effects, negative effects, and also the idioms that we have around the colour purple that make it of such great interest and value to our everyday conversations. So, firstly, let's examine some of the features of purple. Well, it sits between the passionate red and the calming blue of the spectrum, but it ranges in intensity from extremely vibrant and dark right through to very pale and almost insignificant in its hue. It has both warm and cool tones, and the vibrancy and the subtle tones of the colour purple are all related to the type of purple that we see, but also the uses that we put that purple to. Purple is relatively rare in nature as such, although we highly prize purple flowers. It's considered to be exotic and sacred, and it's an exclusive colour that has been imbued with an aura of preciousness throughout the centuries. It's very rarely chosen by children as a colour in their drawings, although some children do tend to prefer purple from the very beginning. But when it does exist, it generally is opposed by its opposite hue, and that is yellow. Whether the yellow is predominant and purple simply an adjunct, or whether purple is prominent and yellow becomes the adjunct. Either way, purple and yellow go together naturally. The range of purples varies from magenta, which is deep purple with a lot of red overtones, through mauve, a medium purple with lots of pink, to lilac, which is a pale purple with just a hint of pink in it. At the other extreme, we have lavender, which is a pale purple with a hint of blue, violet, which is a medium purple with a fair degree of blue, and then finally the indigo flower, which is deep purple with lots of blue in it. Let's now move to the history, the origin of the colour purple. In Neolithic art, dating back 16 to 25,000 years before the Common Era, cave paintings used a mixture of manganese hematite to create purple images. Now, one of the features of purple is that it doesn't matter what it's made from, it tends to have longevity of colour. That is, it stays around for a very, very long time. It is thought to have been originated in the Minoan civilization around the 20th to the 18th century before the Common Era. It was spread by the Phoenician trading empire and was called the Land of Purple. That existed between 1570 before the Common Era right through until Phoenicians eventually died out. There was a mythic discovery of the colour purple by Heracles of Tyre, who took his dog along a beach walk, and the dog apparently bit on a particular type of murex seashell, and his saliva then turned purple. One of the features of the murex secretions is that the intensity of the purple increases with exposure to sunlight, which made it a very interesting colour for the people at the time. Its most prized colour was that was considered to be black tinted clotted blood. Well, I'm afraid that black tinted clotted blood is probably more the colour that I'm wearing rather than the colour of the purple that was known subsequently as Tyrian purple. There are approximately 12,000 murex sea snails that are needed to make 1.5 grams or 5/100ths of an ounce of the Tyrian purple dye. It also has to go through quite a number of different stages in order to stabilize it before it settles down and does nothing to dye fabrics. The Phoenicians, or the Minoans, whichever group it can be attributed to, also produced hyacinth purple. Now, hyacinth purple was created from the crushing of various plants, various minerals, and it produced a more blue version of purple than the Tyrian purple that was so famous and also so precious. The ancient Mexicans and North Africans, surprisingly, also valued purple as a colour. They had similar methods of extraction, and once it was extracted, that purple colour was valued more highly than gold. So a very small amount was worth a lot of gold to the ancient civilizations. So what sorts of uses did these ancient civilizations have for the colour purple? In the Persian Empire, purple dye was both coveted and expensive to the extent that it was adopted by one of their emperors, Cyrus, as a purple garment which he wore as his royal uniform. He also used purple as his standard, along with, as you can see here, yellow and white to accentuate the purple. The Egyptians used purple, particularly purple-coloured stones, to indicate divinity and the afterlife, and it was linked to their spiritual practices through the god-king heritage, so it gradually became a sign of royalty. Jewish people were involved in the manufacture of this Tyrian purple. Now, understandably, the process of creating this dye was one that was not well liked by most people. It had a smell of rotting fish that was as pervasive and long-lasting as the dye itself. In fact, it was so pervasive and so disgusting a smell that it became legal for a woman to divorce her husband if he took up the purple dyeing trade after they were married. The ancient Romans also valued this purple dye. It was one of the colours that was given exclusively to imperial robes, and magistrates of very high standing were also permitted to wear white togas with a purple stripe to indicate their standing in the community. Other uses of purple, however, were punishable by death, which is a pretty harsh result if you happen to have purple hands from dyeing. In the Byzantine Empire, imperial edicts were actually signed in purple ink. So it wasn't just clothing and battle standards that were dyed purple, but purple ink was used to sign important documents. The empresses gave birth to the empire's offspring in purple chambers, which is where the saying "born to the purple" came from. Purple's significance continued in its connection to both royalty and the clergy in Middle Ages. In 1200 Common Era, Pope Innocent made it a symbol of penance, and it represented mourning and religious fervour. The reign of the Tudor monarchs further consolidated the importance of the colour purple. It was symbolic of dignity, state, and regal power. There was an emphasis on wealth and status, and this occurred at such a level that the Earl of Surrey was actually tried for treason for wearing purple under Henry VIII's reign. Queen Elizabeth I created what was known as the sumptuary laws, which meant that purple was for the use of royalty alone, and no one else was permitted to wear that colour. It was also linked to the coats of arms of the royal houses, indicating that purple became a sign of leadership and governance. That symbolism continues today through ceremonial robes, which often take on the colour purple. Power and authority in Western religions is associated with this colour, as are the academic robes, often worn by those of high academic status, and it communicates the idea of both authority and wisdom. In the Victorian era, a flower language was developed that encompassed quite a range of flowers, but in terms of purple flowers, lavender was associated with devotion and grace under pressure. Lilac was the colour of first love and youthful innocence. Violet became the colour associated with modesty and spiritual wisdom, whereas the purple rose was associated with enchantment and mystical love. The Irish was considered to be symbolic of cherished friendship, hope, and valour. Hyacinths were all about sorrow, forgiveness, and sincerity. That is, purple hyacinths. Pink and white hyacinths had different meanings. The orchid was all about luxury, beauty, and magnificence. So you can see from those meanings that a posy of various different flowers could give quite a stark message to the recipient. In 1856, an 18-year-old man by the name of William Henry Perkin synthesized a purple dye. He was actually looking for a cure for malaria, but came across this dye, which was very effective in rich materials such as velvet, heavy silks, and wool. And later in life, he was knighted for his efforts. The Victorians actually adopted this colour for mourning. It was expressive of gravity, sorrow, and sadness. And after the death of Prince Albert, Victoria herself took to wearing purple. That symbolism continued on into the Edwardian era, where there were various different levels of purple associated with different levels of mourning. Its modern use in fashion is all about sophistication and originality. It combines the assertiveness of red with the compassion of blue, but it's not to everybody's taste. The organic electronics industry also uses purple discs as a semiconductor to produce transistors and circuits. These discs are made of silicon with the dye embedded in them. There is a current search for antimicrobial effects of the colour purple, and it seems to be relatively effective against some multi-drug resistant bacteria. But one of the downsides of the colour purple is that the true colour cannot be rendered by computer monitors. So the colour you are seeing on your screen now is a variant of how that colour would appear in real life. How then was purple given its title as a basic colour term? The earliest that we know of is the Greek porphyra, which denotes the mollusks themselves. Latin turned that word into purpura, which also denotes the same mollusks. But all other purples are actually named after flowers. So, for example, violet is derived from the Latin viola, from the wildflower of the same name, and mauve derives its name from mauvine, which is the French mallow flower. Turning now to culture. Purple was very popular in art, music, and literature as a colour of significance. The pre-Raphaelite art of the 1850s tended to mix cobalt blue and madder, which is a red colour, to make cobalt violet. Problem was with this particular combination, it was toxic, and it wasn't until a less toxic form of purple paint was established that this colour became one that was accepted universally. Gustav Klimt, for example, was particularly fond of purple and yellow, as was Vincent van Gogh, although one of his most famous paintings, The Starry Night, contained more green than it did yellow. Nevertheless, purple featured prominently. In the 1960s culture, psychedelic purple became very common. It embodied counterculture, unconventionality, and artistic brilliance. In music, sensuality, rebellion, and experimentation were associated with the colour purple. It was also a symbol of introspection and passion, and more often than not, purple was paired with brilliant orange to indicate those particular meanings. For literature, the purple is all about mystery, magic, and emotional introspection. It embodies the surreal, the unpredictable, and the fantastic. And purple features prominently in the stories of the Harry Potter series. Purple is also prominent in film and pop culture. Science fiction films often use purple to indicate advanced technology, alienation, and some form of enigmatic beauty. In fantasy films, magic potions, spells, quirkiness, and settings related to the unknown and the potentially dangerous are all associated with the colour purple. In animation, purple often denotes the idea of power, darkness, mystery, and the magical nature of the objects that are coloured that purple. Video games, too, use purple for indicating magical powers, cosmic energy, and charismatic or evil characters. Many successful brands have chosen purple as a distinctive element of their visual identities. So Cadbury chose it as an indicator of its links to the royal warrant in Victorian times. Yahoo uses it to convey strength and mystery. The Swiss chocolate manufacturer Milka decided that purple was the ideal colour to indicate sweetness and quality. FedEx's logo of purple and orange is all about indicating professionalism and innovation. Taco Bell also uses purple, which evokes comfort and originality. Sports teams, such as the LA Lakers, use purple and yellow to indicate courage. The airline Wizz Air communicates affordable luxury through its use of purple, whereas the bottles of Crown Royal whiskey are wrapped in purple velvet bags to indicate luxury. And interestingly, the largest denomination poker chip, the one with the highest value of $5,000 is also coloured purple. Purple has been used as an indicator of social change and social movements as well. The purple, white and green emblem was adopted by the suffragettes in 1908. It embodied the instinct of freedom and dignity, and these medals of green, white and purple were gifted to those women who went on hunger strike and had been released from prison after their incarceration. Later on, that same women's movement suffered from what they called the Lavender Menace. And this was in the 1960s, where there was an exclusion of lesbians from the women's movement. The colour there was associated with power and progress, but also the refusal to accept bearers of certain types of femininity. Purple was taken on as the symbol of the anti-apartheid marches in Cape Town, South Africa, after purple dye was sprayed by police onto the protesters. This was primarily to make sure that the protesters could be identified after the protest, but nevertheless, purple then became their standard colour of protest. Remembrance of the Armenian genocide is associated with the purple flower forget-me-not, but also each year certain buildings are lit up in purple lights to commemorate that particular genocidal activity. The book and subsequent film of The Colour Purple was all about talking of the slavery of Black people within the United States of America, in particularly their southern states. And more recently, the Israelites are Black Hebrew United States citizens which claim to have original Jewish status rather than white Jewish people. And they, although still a very minor group within society, are developing increasing prominence among Jewish people. Non-Western cultures also have a reverence for the colour purple. The Chinese Han dynasty, which ranged from 202 BCE to approximately 220 BCE, admired the colour, but it was not prized as such. It was a non-traditional choice for artisans. However, Chinese ambassadors also wore purple as a sign of imperial favour. In the Japanese Heian period of 794 to 1185 Common Era, purple became a colour associated with great refinement and social status, wealth, and of course power. Elegance and prestige were associated with this colour, and it was primarily worn by women, not men. In Native American cultures, purple represents wisdom, healing, and gratitude. And here we have an example of an ancient belt made of purple elements from a Native American culture. In Thailand, purple is worn by grieving widows to respect the dead and to commemorate them. Grief, reflection, and remembrance are the key associations of purple. In Iran, purple is an omen of the future. It's considered to be the colour of the sun during an eclipse and adorns many of their mosques. In modern Egypt, the lotus flower represents virtue and faith, and so is associated with religious practices. However, it also is associated with some secular practices. Football teams wear purple, as do some belly dancers. And of course, purple continues to feature in religious observances. For Christianity, purple is associated with both Advent and with Lent. These indicates penance, humility, and mourning, as well as rebirth. But purple is also associated with the 7 deadly sins, as in vanity, greed, and pride. It's also linked to black magic and the powers that are supposedly associated with the practice of black magic. In Ukraine, there is a practice of dyeing eggs for Easter called pisanki. And here, purple is one of the favoured colours because it represents faith, patience, and trust. In Tibet, where Buddhism reigns, amethyst is sacred to the Buddha. It indicates aspiration for enlightenment and a commitment to spirituality and reverence. In Hinduism, Purple is associated with the Lord Krishna, who is often seen as either blue or purple skinned. So it is associated with royal heritage, wisdom, compassion. Furthermore, Ayurveda healing practices also revere the color purple as a symbol of spiritual growth and healing itself. In terms of the physical effects of purple on the body, it's the hardest color for the eye to discriminate. It can cause tiredness and frustration for many people when it is used in abundance, and if that is the case, the idea is to switch to looking at something yellow for a short period of time in order to refresh the ocular mechanisms. Too much purple in the environment is overpowering, and it can cause moodiness and disquiet. In terms of psychological effects, it's an aid to spirituality and contemplation. It helps to develop imagination and creativity, and it can be used in various forms to relieve migraine headaches and other forms of pain. It also has the ability to suppress appetite, but this all depends on the type of purple. Pale purples tend to be considered to be calming, beauteous, offer a sense of youthfulness, and be associated with femininity, selflessness, and nurture. Medium-grade purples are all associated with enhanced creativity, purity, and holiness, whereas dark purples depend on whether or not they are dark reddish, as in magenta, which is all about strength and courage and associated with masculinity, or indigo, which is also associated with dreaming, meditation, and enlightenment, and associated with more spiritual practices, whether they be masculine or feminine in nature. So the positive effects of purple, or the positive images of purple, involve ceremony, ritual, and meditation. Spirituality, faith, penance, sensitivity, calmness, contemplation, magic, and mysticism are all associated with ceremony, ritual, and meditation practices. The unconscious and subconscious minds are also associated with the color purple, and this has to do with creativity, inspiration, imagination, awareness, and originality. But it's also associated with passion, bravery, and courage when it's a reddish purple, or unpretentiousness and coolness when it's a bluish purple. Of course, there is still the original link with nobility, aristocracy, and royalty, which is all about wealth, opulence, elegance, and luxury. But in modern times, purple is now associated with intelligence, high tech, and creativity, as well as all of these other positive images. Purple also has some negative images and connotations. It's classified as a bringer of bad luck in certain circumstances. So devil worship, black magic, the unknown and mysterious tend to be associated with the color purple. It can symbolize sadness, infertility, death, and mourning, and for those who are superstitious, it's a color to be avoided at weddings or other forms of celebration. Purple is also associated with conceit and pomposity. There is self-involvement, entitlement, cruelty, arrogance, instability, and self-indulgent, all associated with this color. It is also associated with eccentricity and immaturity. There is also a link with formality, inflexibility, and suppression of discontent. So rebellion and nonconformity are issues that will associate with this color. When we examine the idioms that are associated with the color purple, one of the first created was, of course, the idea of being born to the purple. This indicates a legitimate regal heritage. Donning the purple, on the other hand, is ascending to high office, and as Julius Caesar found out, once he donned the purple, it also made him a target for some very unhappy protagonists. Purple with rage is all about uncontrollable anger. Purple speech is profanity and raunchy language. A purple haze is a drug-induced confusion or euphoria, and these days, in its newly acquired legitimacy, it's also a type of marijuana. Purple prose is all about elaborately written items, such as poems or descriptive passages, where simple descriptions would probably do, but instead it is over-the-top writing. A Purple Heart is a United States military award for bravery. A purple state, again talking of the United States, is a state in which there is an equal distribution of Republican and Democrat voters. A purple planet is actually a designation given to two of the planets in our solar system, Jupiter and Venus, although both of them are in fact orange in reality. Both reflect a blue light, which in certain circumstances make them appear to be purple. In summary then, purple has a long association with wealth. As a basic color term, it links to fauna originally, but all the variations that we create these days to indicate a type of purple are associated with flowers. It has a wide diversity of meanings, both positive and negative, and although it's remained popular for millennia, it depends on the red-blue influence, the shades and the tints as to whether or not it is a positive purple or a negative purple. And it has been adopted by both power and those who resist that power as an indicator of their particular political stance. And that's it for the colour purple. I hope this little foray into that colour has been of interest to you and that you've learnt something you didn't know before. When we next visit purple, it will be to look at it in terms of how it creates a personality type. I hope you'll stay with me for that particular session. Until then, may purple imbue your life with the sort of healing messages, the inspiration, the calmness, and power that's necessary for you to carry out your everyday existence with the minimal amount of fuss. Bye.